Yes, and everybody got mad with me for saying that. You know, I didn't mind telling the world that I was gay. I was gay, and it's nice to be happy." He laughed as he said it, but there was a tremor underneath. He was something else entirely. People who met him up close would later confess they had never encountered anyone like him in their lives. Not because he was evil, not because he was cruel, but because he seemed to be fighting a private war no one else could see. He was the rock and roll comet America, both worshipped and feared. A flamboyant, screaming, eyeliner-wearing icon who turned pianos into weapons and stages into battlegrounds. But when the house lights faded and the crowds went home, Little Richard moved like a man negotiating with demons in the dark. His firebrand sermons, his sudden returns to religion, his public declarations of repentance. Some insiders believed those were less about faith and more about camouflage, elaborate smokescreens to hide a life threaded with secret affairs, shame, and panic. For decades, whenever someone asked him, "Who did you really love?" he danced around the question. He joked, he dodged, he preached, but he never answered. The real rupture came not from a rival, not from a jealous lover, but from the one person the law ever acknowledged as his wife. Ernestine Campbell, his only legal spouse, eventually refused to keep holding the silence. In rare, careful comments, she didn't just hint at the truth of their fragile marriage. According to later reports, she also pointed indirectly toward 5 gay artists whose names sent ripples through Hollywood's back rooms. 5 men whose paths crossed Little Richard's in the shadows. 5 alleged secret lovers, each carrying a story that, if fully told, could have cracked open the carefully managed image of a repentant legend. 1. Billy Preston, the 5th Beatle and the love that never spoke its own name. The name Billy Preston still echoes through the history of soul, funk, and classic rock. To the public, he was the smiling keyboard genius whose hands danced across the keys on tracks like Get Back, the only non-Beatle whose name ever appeared on one of their single labels. Behind the scenes, he was a go-to collaborator for the Rolling Stones, Ray Charles, Eric Clapton, and more. If you listened to records in the 60 seconds and 70 seconds, you heard Billy, even when you didn't know it. But beneath the glitter of studios and stadiums, Billy carried a secret he rarely confronted in public. It was a secret woven out of trauma, isolation, addiction, and a long, ambiguous entanglement with another troubled pioneer, Little Richard. They first crossed paths in 1962 on a southern U.S. tour. Billy was just 16, a soft-spoken, church-trained organ prodigy discovered and mentored by Ray Charles. Richard, by contrast, was already a star, the living embodiment of rock and roll excess, trying to squeeze himself back into a religious suit that never quite fit. According to people on that tour, Richard was instantly drawn to Billy's innocence, his gentle way of speaking, his almost fragile politeness, and a talent that felt less learned than gifted by God. Crew members later claimed that from the first rehearsals, Richard watched Billy the way a man watches something he can't afford to lose. There was one problem. Richard wasn't a free man anymore. By 1962, he had been married for over a year to Ernestine, a reserved Catholic woman working as a church secretary in Washington, D.C. Their 1,959 wedding had been celebrated as his redemption arc. The wild rock and roll sinner was supposedly reborn, renouncing the stage, devoting himself to prayer, and promising to leave behind the world of sex, drugs, and chaos. But once he returned to performing in the early 60 seconds, the old patterns didn't just creep back, they kicked the door in. That 1,962 tour was his first long separation from Ernestine, the first real test of his so-called reformed life. According to one crew member, Richard rarely called home, he barely mentioned his wife. Instead, he made something else clear. "That boy is mine. His room needs to be next to mine on this tour." From the moment Billy joined the traveling party, Richard's behavior reportedly shifted. He gave up his usual VIP suite and moved into a more cramped room near the tech wing simply because it was closer to where Billy slept. On stage, he started bringing Billy out front for organ solos, shining a spotlight on him in a way he'd never done for any other bandmate. Off stage, a pattern formed that people still remember in hushed tones. Every morning, hotel staff and crew saw the same thing. Richard's door closed, breakfast trays wheeled inside, and the young prodigy slipping in or out, often with his hair uncombed, his eyes heavy from lack of sleep. The two ate together, prayed together, rehearsed together. The door stayed shut. Hundreds of miles away, Ernestine kept her steady life at her church home in Washington, unaware that her husband, the man who had renounced rock for righteousness, was, according to some insiders, risking his public image, his marriage, and his spiritual persona just to keep a 16-year-old boy within arm's reach. By 1964, the marriage was over. No explosive headlines, no lawsuit, no public war over money. It simply ended, quietly, like a candle snuffed out in a locked room. Years later, in one rare, icy comment, Ernestine offered a line that still chills anyone who hears it. "I thought I married a man searching for the light. Turns out he was just running from a different shadow." Many suspected that shadow's name was Billy Preston. During that 3-month run, the two were said to be nearly inseparable in hotels from Atlanta to Birmingham. They showed up together for meals. They were seen shoulder to shoulder in church pews on Sundays, as if trying to wash something off their souls that wouldn't come clean. But the real whispers came from backstage. A stage manager later recalled stumbling into Richard's room late one night, looking for a missing mic stand. What he saw froze him in place. Billy, resting his head in Richard's lap. The two of them laughing softly, like teenagers sharing a secret. "There was nothing overtly sexual in that snapshot," he insisted. "But the energy in that room, it sent a chill down my spine." Even after Billy left Richard's touring band to build his own solo career, the connection didn't simply evaporate. In 1969, when the Beatles were recording Let It Be at Abbey Road, Billy seemed to appear in London out of thin air, invited by George Harrison to join the sessions. What most people didn't know was that, according to a former housekeeper, Billy had reportedly been staying at Richard's home for nearly a week beforehand. The housekeeper claimed the atmosphere inside that house was volatile. "They argued all night," she said. "Then I'd see them holding each other, both of them crying. I don't know what they were to each other, but it was not just friendship." By then, Billy Preston was no longer the innocent prodigy trailing behind a flamboyant mentor. Behind the polished sessions with the Beatles, Stones, and Ray Charles, his life was unraveling. His temper flared backstage. He smashed hotel rooms during violent withdrawal episodes. His cocaine habit became so severe that, according to some who worked with him, his nose bled mid-performance, streaking his face under the stage lights. The most explosive incident surfaced in April 1977. Billy was arrested by Los Angeles police for allegedly assaulting a man at the Neon Lounge, an underground gay bar in West Hollywood, known to insiders but rarely mentioned in polite company. According to police documents and later interviews, the fight erupted after a heated argument that seemed to hit something raw inside him. A witness recalled hearing him scream, "Don't you dare say that name," before swinging his fists like a man possessed. The other man reportedly refused to fight back, repeating one sentence over and over, "He doesn't love you anymore." Many believed the unspoken name was Little Richard. The tabloids swarmed, speculating that the victim might have been Billy's new secret partner, someone who had weaponized the memory of the one figure who haunted him most. The story, however, didn't last long. Lawyers stepped in. No charges were ultimately filed. The case evaporated from the front pages as quickly as it appeared. But from that night on, within industry circles, Billy's name came with a quiet warning: dangerous. And Little Richard? He never commented publicly on the Neon Lounge incident. Not once. As the years crawled by, a darker echo emerged. In 1991, Billy himself was accused of sexually abusing a 16-year-old boy in Florida. The case was dismissed for lack of evidence, but the damage was done. His reputation, already fragile, began to rot. Record labels lost interest. New albums quietly flopped. Billy withdrew. He rarely gave interviews. He never publicly addressed his sexuality in any clear way, staying locked in a pattern of half-answers and nervous smiles. But behind closed doors, friends said he admitted what the world already suspected. In one private confession, he reportedly said, "I never loved anyone like I loved Richard, but that's something I could never say out loud." In 2006, Billy Preston died at 59 after a prolonged coma caused by kidney failure and infection. The bright, boyish face in old photos was long gone. What remained was a tragic case file of what-ifs. In a 2011 biography titled "You Are So Beautiful," author Kenneth Womack described Billy as a lifelong gay man who never felt safe enough to be himself. A sentence that reads less like a label and more like a verdict on the era that shaped him. Singer Mary Clayton, one of his longtime friends, would later say that his death was a kind of freedom release from a life he had been forced to live in two halves, never daring to let them touch. Meanwhile, Little Richard had long since pivoted back into religious life, giving up rock again in the 70 seconds to become a full-time preacher. He thundered from pulpits warning against sins he had once embraced. Through it all, he rarely, if ever, mentioned Billy Preston's name in public. It was as if that chapter had been sealed inside a vault. But in a final Rolling Stone interview in 2013, a journalist slipped in a question that cut through the performance. Had he ever truly loved anyone? Richard paused. The silence hung so long, it felt like another kind of confession. There was someone, he finally said. But I should never say his name. To the world, Billy Preston will always be remembered as the fifth Beatle, the secret ingredient in other men's masterpieces. But in the dim corridors beyond the stage lights, many believed he was something else entirely, Little Richard's baby brother, as some close to Richard allegedly heard him say. A casualty of a world that refused to accept the truth about gay black artists. Billy carried a quiet love that was never granted a name, a future, or a public goodbye. That love, never acknowledged, lingers like a sorrowful ballad nobody was brave enough to write down. Before Madonna, before RuPaul, before Prince turned androgyny into a global spectacle, there was a voice rolling out of San Francisco like a thunderstorm Sylvester. To many, he was the sound of the late 70 seconds, a shimmering disco priest in sequins and heels, the living pulse of queer nightlife. He was openly gay, defiantly feminine, and absolutely unafraid on stage. But behind the jeweled gowns, the bold makeup, and the radiant smile, there was a missing chapter, a stretch of time around 1966 and 1967, when Sylvester vanished from the Oakland church stages and the local queer community. According to friends and early collaborators, he retreated into a quiet rental apartment near South Central Los Angeles, like a star being pulled into a black hole. At that same moment, Little Richard was peeling off his own mask. The holy man persona he had worn in public, the preacher who denounced rock and roll, began to crack. In a March 1966 interview with Jet magazine, his words hit religious readers like a slap. He spoke as if he were a man who had stopped pretending to be saved and decided to drown openly. People later said he was living like a demon who could play piano, no sermons, no soft gospel choruses, just liquor, late nights, and a hunger that burned until sunrise. Around this time, a tiny, notorious underground gay club known as the Purple Door flickered to life beneath the neon haze of Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles. Its reputation was whispered, not advertised, a sanctuary for the lost, the reckless, and the people who didn't fit any box the law recognized. A waiter named Manuel Gonzalez would later recall a pattern. Every Friday, as the purple lights pulsed in the smoke-heavy air, Little Richard would arrive sometimes alone, sometimes already buzzing with energy. And then, one night, he was not alone. Beside him glided a thin black boy in a deep red sequin dress, heavy eyeliner darkening his eyes, moving across the dance floor like cigarette smoke. The boy sang like a fallen angel whose wings had been ripped off. When he danced, it looked less like a performance and more like a possession. Every hip roll, every turn, carried the weight of defiance and the dare of raw sex. No one walked up to ask his name. They didn't have to. In the corners and bathrooms, away from the music, people whispered it like a secret password. Sylvester. From the moment their names started to be linked, the Purple Doors shows stopped feeling like normal club nights. According to people who claimed they were there, the performances took on a ritualistic tone, long, feverish, and almost religious in their blasphemy. These were ceremonies, they said, that God would never have been invited to. In June 1966, an incident at the El Cortez Hotel in downtown Los Angeles left a lasting mark on the staff who saw it. Housekeeping was instructed not to enter room 409 for 3 days because a valued VIP was staying there. One disobedient staff member later admitted that curiosity won. He cracked open the door and froze. Little Richard lounged in a fur coat, laughing loudly. On the liquor-soaked table, a young black man in a shiny leather bodysuit and a silver wig was singing and dancing as if the room were a private stage. Cash was scattered across the floor like confetti. The tension, the intimacy, the way Richard watched the boy, it was unmistakable. The staffer later insisted that the young man was Sylvester. According to those hotel records, management issued a warning. By the 14th of June, 1966, both men were asked to leave. After that, something eerie happened. Sylvester seemed to disappear. He stopped performing with the Disquotes in San Francisco. He stopped showing up in church choirs. The boy who had once been everywhere in the local scene simply went off the grid for nearly 2 years. Then, in 1969, he reappeared like a ghost reborn. At the Castro Street Gay Fair, he stepped onto the stage in full drag, a slashed silver gown and shoulder-length curled wig, claiming the crowd with the confidence of someone who had chosen a side and was never going back. When asked why he had moved fully into feminine performance, he smiled and said, "Someone very famous once told me, either burn bright or disappear." Many later believed that someone was Little Richard. There were nights backstage at the End Up nightclub in San Francisco when Sylvester, tipsy and open, would joke that Richard had opened my eyes to indulgence to what men can do together without shame. A former backup dancer claimed that Sylvester, drunk and unguarded, once blurted, "If it weren't for Richard, I'd still be singing gospel with moaning old ladies in church." That awakening, some said, came with a steep cost. In 1973, Sylvester was banned from performing at the New Orleans Jazz Festival after organizers realized the star they had booked was a male-born performer in revealing women's clothing. 2 years later, in 1975, he was arrested in Atlanta for public indecency after walking the street in a sheer fishnet dress that left little to the imagination. The backlash didn't end with the police. Sylvester became entangled in multiple sexual misconduct accusations. In 1978, a young dancer named Marcus filed a lawsuit claiming he had been detained and sexually coerced in a dressing room. The suit ultimately went nowhere. But the rumor wind carried the story far and wide. Within his own camp, whispers spread about lover auditions among his dancers, young men called into private rehearsals that allegedly had little to do with choreography. Some ex-performers suggested Sylvester had picked up that habit from a fiery old man in Los Angeles, a description many assumed referred to Little Richard. That same year, in an interview with Interview magazine, the question finally came out in the open. Did you live with Little Richard in 1966? Sylvester's response was a smirk and a riddle. "I lived with someone," he said, "who made love through a piano." He left it there, refusing to say any more. Despite the rising fame that came with his disco anthem, "You Make Me Feel Mighty Real," Sylvester often behaved like a man in hiding. He dodged questions about the lost years in Los Angeles. He brushed off inquiries about specific relationships. Friends later claimed that he sometimes jolted awake at night, screaming, "Richard, stop," as if replaying scenes no one else had witnessed. In 1988, Sylvester died of AIDS-related complications. He left behind a legacy that reshaped queer music and identity and a cluster of unanswered questions. Among his belongings, there was a faded photograph dated May 1966. It showed a curly-haired teenager sitting beside a man in a lion fur coat, their hands clasped tightly together, smiling under dim neon lights. The picture was later confirmed to have been taken backstage at the Purple Door. The older man was Little Richard, the boy at his side, the one who would someday become the mighty, unapologetic Sylvester, was not yet an icon. Back then, he was still a child in sequins, learning what it meant to be mighty real, through a love that had to stay forbidden, undocumented, and unspoken. In the shimmering, electric world orbiting around Prince, there was always another figure moving just behind the purple glow: André Cymone. He was Prince's childhood companion, his early creative partner, the quiet bassist who helped carve out the sound that would become Minneapolis funk. But André was more than a sideman. In underground circles, he was notorious for pushing gender to the edge: midriff-bearing crop tops, tight leather pants, shimmering lip gloss, and a gaze that refused to answer to male or female. And then, just as Prince's star exploded into the mainstream, André slipped away from the spotlight. He didn't vanish completely, but he moved in a way that left behind a trail of rumors. According to industry whispers, he had stepped into a new, secret collaboration with someone almost no one expected: Little Richard. In late 1979, Little Richard launched a tour called Back to Rock and Roll Roots, winding through cities across the northern United States. When the tour hit Minneapolis, it was said that several crew members and musicians were suddenly replaced after contract disputes. On that replacement list, according to an internal memo later cited from the Midnight Chariot Agency, was the name André Cymone, freshly departed from Prince's band, reportedly frustrated with living in his friend's shadow. He was hired, the memo claimed, to play bass for 3 shows: December 12th through 14th, 1979, at the State Theater in Minneapolis, followed by dates in Milwaukee and Detroit. Then came the night of December 15th. According to a stage technician who worked the tour, something unusual happened at the Plaza Hotel in Milwaukee. Both Richard and André were said to have effectively disappeared inside room 9006 for nearly 48 hours. The tech recalled that Richard personally spoke to hotel management, instructing staff not to disturb them and implying that the entire floor was theirs. Food carts were left at the door. Funk music reportedly poured down the hallway for hours, but no one saw either man step out. One hotel staff member, who chose to remain anonymous, later claimed that he had to enter the room after hearing loud banging, as if furniture were being knocked over. When he opened the door, what he saw stuck with him for years. According to his account, Richard sat at an organ wearing nothing but a towel, fingers resting on the keys. André lay across the sofa, midriff exposed, eyes red and glassy as though he had been crying or was high on something. The room, the staffer insisted, was thick with smoke and carried a smell he couldn't even name. Shortly after that incident, the Detroit date on the tour was abruptly canceled. Richard reportedly vanished from the schedule for a full week. André, on the other hand, flew straight back to Minneapolis without explanation. No official statement was ever given. On paper, it was just a canceled show. Off the record, people began to talk. From that point forward, André's public image and music began to shift. His debut solo album, Living in the New Wave, 1982, carried a sound that many listeners said felt haunted by Little Richard's early gospel-fused rock and roll soaring vocals, cryptic lyrics, and emotionally charged keyboard passages that seemed to teeter between church and nightclub. On the album cover, André stared into the camera in a mesh shirt and heavy eye makeup, looking both beautiful and disturbed, like someone caught between revelation and breakdown. In a 1983 interview with Smash Hits magazine, a reporter pressed him about his new persona, this mix of sacred, erotic, and unstable. André simply smiled and offered one line. "Someone once told me, God has no gender. I'm just trying to find a higher self." Many people who knew the timeline believed this was a distorted echo or even a parody of the wild, contradictory sermons Little Richard delivered during his late 70 seconds descent into excess. The industry did not handle André's transformation well. He refused to clean up his act, refused to tone down his too weird, too unmarketable style. Eventually, he was dropped by Columbia Records. Soon after, rumors began circulating about a private video allegedly showing André in intimate contact with a male dancer, circulating among New York music insiders. The tape was never publicly confirmed, but just the whispers were enough to stain his reputation in an era that labeled such images career suicide. Though André never directly addressed his sexuality in interviews, he was widely believed, within Minneapolis circles, to be at least bisexual. Stories spread of love triangles and secret all-male parties within Prince's inner circle. gatherings that blurred lines between friendship, worship, and desire. In an unpublished memoir titled Jungle Love and Basslines, a former assistant in Prince's camp reportedly wrote, "Andre was obsessed with Richard. He called him the prophet of rebellion and said he didn't feel fully alive until he was locked in that Milwaukee hotel room for 3 days." It was a claim that painted their time together as something like a twisted spiritual awakening, part mentor, part lover, part mirror. As the years wore on, Andre receded from the front of the stage. He focused instead on production and songwriting, working behind the scenes, while his own name slowly faded from mainstream memory. He married 3 times, each union ending quickly in divorce. Those still in his orbit said he became a ghost in his own life, reclusive, hard to reach, almost never seen in public unless absolutely necessary. In a 1997 letter to an old friend, later quoted in fragments by people close to him, Andre allegedly wrote, "I don't know who was right or wrong, but I do know I lost my soul somewhere inside the sound of an organ played by someone I should never have touched." Maybe that is what Little Richard really left behind in people like Andre. Not just hits, not just shock value, but a slow-burning fire buried deep in the chests of sensitive men. A flame that made them feel larger than life for a moment and then left them scorched, exiled, and unsure of who they were without him. There is something unnerving about Frankie Lyman's voice on Why Do Fools Fall in Love? It sounds impossibly pure, almost angelic, but underneath that crystal tone, listeners have long felt something else. A thin, aching cry from a child who never really got to be a child at all. In less than 3 years, Frankie went from national sensation to a drifting shadow, swallowed by addiction, scandals, and a death so lonely it feels like a bad joke. 25 years old, slumped on the bathroom floor of his grandmother's home in Harlem, a needle and a habit, finally finishing what the industry had started. But long before the public watched him collapse, some people believed another man had already noticed his fragility and possibly taken advantage of it. That man was Little Richard. In September 1956, when Frankie was just 13, he and his group, the Teenagers, shared a bill with Little Richard at a major showcase at the Paramount Theater in New York. Many music historians consider that night the turning point, the first documented moment when Richard's attention locked onto the boy with the baby face and the trembling eyes. A backstage photograph captured by freelance photographer Marvin Haskins shows Richard standing behind Frankie, arms draped over the teenager's shoulders. On the surface, it looks like a playful embrace between a veteran and a young fan. But those who have studied the image note a disturbing detail, the look in Frankie's eyes. It doesn't radiate the wild joy of a kid meeting his idol. Instead, he looks like someone forcing a smile, jaw tight, eyes not quite matching his mouth. Within weeks, crew members on the circuit began whispering that Frankie was spending a lot of time in Richard's hotel room after shows. A lighting technician named Clyde Wilkins later recalled a pattern that became impossible to ignore. "Many nights," he said, "I'd see Richard have chocolate milk, marshmallows, and records sent up to his room. Little Frankie would sit in there all night. By the time we were clearing the stage around dawn, that boy would finally walk out eyes red, shirt wrinkled, looking like he'd been somewhere he couldn't explain." In January 1957, the 2 acts were booked on the Package Show of Stars tour across the American South, hitting stops from Alabama to Tennessee. The tour was notorious for its lack of real supervision, especially when it came to underage performers. Chaperones were scarce. Hotel rules were flexible. The stage might have belonged to the kids, but the nights belonged to the adults. A local stagehand in a Georgia town, Richard's hometown, later claimed he once saw Frankie walking barefoot out of a roadside motel with Richard at his side, smiling like he was in a trance. There was, he said, a visible bruise on the boy's neck. When someone quietly asked about it, Richard allegedly laughed and brushed it off. "That kid needs love," he was remembered as saying, "and I'm the only one who knows how to give it to him." It was not the first time Richard had been accused, even in whispers, of gravitating toward vulnerable young male singers. But with Frankie, the attachment seemed different, more intense, more possessive. In a 1962 interview with Ebony magazine, Richard himself admitted, Frankie Lyman was the kid I loved most in showbiz. I once thought of adopting him, but life didn't give me that chance. For some readers, it sounded like the tender regret of a mentor. For others, it raised questions no one wanted to say out loud. Frankie's professional life began to crumble in 1958. Once separated from the teenagers, his solo career stalled. Record sales dropped. The machine that had pushed his angelic image to the front of America's living rooms simply moved on. By 15, he was reportedly hooked on heroin. The sweet-faced boy people had watched on TV was soon wandering from city to city, telling stories to get money, falling in and out of love overnight, and running from every promise he made. During a 1963 arrest in Baltimore for vandalism, police records noted an odd item found in his pocket, a necklace engraved with the letters RNF Forever. It was never officially explained. Within industry circles, some claimed it stood for Richard and Frankie, a private declaration carried in secret. Others dismissed it as a coincidence. The truth never surfaced. Rumor has it that around 1964, while Richard was working at a studio in New Orleans, Frankie showed up at the door desperate, asking for a chance to record. A studio employee later claimed that Richard initially refused, insisting he no longer wanted anything to do with the boys' chaos. But when Frankie broke down crying, saying, "I've got no one left," Richard allegedly softened, held him, and brought him into the studio for a session. According to that same story, the songs they recorded that night were never released. Some people claim the tapes were destroyed almost immediately, too risky, too revealing, too loaded with memories neither man wanted preserved. None of this was ever confirmed on paper, but the rumor lingered like cigarette smoke in a closed room. As the years went by, Frankie's life only grew more tangled. 3 murky marriages of dubious legality, a criminal charge involving financial fraud, reports of a girlfriend pressured into an abortion that